Hey guys, Bhargav here. Today I'm bringing you three of my recent games. All three have two themes that are common. One is that I was down either material or strategically. I didn't have an advantage to win, whether I was playing as a white or black. And the other was in each game I turned the tables trapping or grabbing the queen of my opponent, completely changing the game right after. So here we go. This is my first game that I want to show you. It started as normal. I'm playing white, king's pawn response with king's pawn on e6 for black, knight, normal development here, right? But I chose to decline queen's pawn there. Didn't want to just jump into grabbing the pawn without further development. My opponent decides to push the pawn. The idea is to bring out the bishop and start the development on the white lines. This is where I chose to challenge the center because now it gives my queen in that line. And I also have this white bishop if black decides to take. Black decided not to take that, and that's fine. I just started with the pawn exchange there. And at this point, after black took, I just pinned white's knight against white's king. And so here, again, normal development. There isn't much going on here other than normal development. There isn't much of a, an advantage for one side versus the other. I decided to continue development with my knight with the idea of jumping and grabbing the pawn here on d5 and then giving me an eventual uh, position going up to c7. And depending on where the queen and other pieces are, I might even be able to fork king and rook. So that was really the idea. And black responded with knight instead of trying to really protect the pawn. It tried to somehow strengthen the knight, even though the knight is actually already protected with the pawn and the queen. So I'm not sure if this was really the best move anyway. But this is where black actually made a mistake, the first one. And so, of course, I grabbed the pawn, now really threatening the queen. And I'm not sure if my opponent actually saw this attack or not, or completely missed it. But in winning in chess, it's just as much your skills as luck and identifying the opportunities of your opponent's mistake. So, of course, this is where my opponent made his biggest blunder, trying to push away my knight, hoping for an exchange here, either with the bishop or with the queen. Of course, completely missing the fact that I am threatening the queen. So at this point, obviously, I did what I would do and took the queen. Not only my opponent lost the queen, it's about to lose the rook because they are in check. So there isn't much they can do about it. At most, they would eventually win my bishop here, but at a very heavy cost of losing the queen and a rook. So of course it's a completely winning game for me, and at that time my opponent resigned. Um, like I said, it was about an equal game on this one anyway, but the theme played out as I grabbed the queen. Let's take a look at different game here. So this is my second game that I played on the same day. And here I'm playing black. My opponent started with king's pawn. I responded in kind. Um, and my opponent decided to play the queen immediately. Now, these are the games that I love because people fall for it sometimes, but I know better as to, this is where you can really punish your opponent. So I didn't take the bait. I strengthened my pawn, so the queen eventually cannot really just come out and take this pawn. You will see that in a moment. And the opponent brought out the bishop. Again, the idea here is to give a quick checkmate, but the fool's mate is not my game, of course. That's something I know well, so didn't take that bait. The idea, of course, is so if I go back a step, instead of my pawn, if I would bring out my knight, queen can take the pawn, giving the check. And then if I respond with bishop, queen can actually take this pawn and eventually rook. Um, well, actually, no, sorry. I would have this knight in the middle, so that wouldn't work. But queen definitely has some ideas here. Having taken my pawn, having given check and moved my bishop, it definitely has um, some ideas here in the center. Um, to stop that, like I said, I started with fortifying my pawn. So that was the first step. Then the bishop came out, and that's when I actually responded with my knight on h6. Now, I don't like my knights on the edge of the board usually, but bringing out the knight to f6 would have been a mistake because then it would be an immediate checkmate. There is nothing I can do there. There is nothing protecting that pawn. And that's really why I instead played um, my knight to h6, protecting my pawn. Now queen cannot give me a checkmate, cannot attack that. Now, of course, if the bishop decides to attack that first, I can trade off bishop for a knight. Queen can come, but that would be a loss for white, so they cannot try that. And so the white then moves the pawn, opening the attack on my knight. Um, And that's fine, I guess. It wasn't the best move for me, but I decided to push off the queen here so that if my knight is attacked, it is protected, and I'm also attacking the queen. So that really was the idea. And white decided to move the queen. Now, this is where I should have I should have looked at some possibilities here, really. Um, Most probably, what I would play normally is bring my bishop out and challenge the bishop so that the bishop cannot continue attacking this along with the queen. Anyhow, right now the queen is attacking, so is bishop, and again, I have my knight protecting it, but not for long because the bishop from white is going to take that knight. This is where I made the blunder and I moved my bishop. That actually wasn't the best move. This could have been bad for me. So, as you would see, my opponent immediately took the knight. Now I don't have anything protecting this square here on f7. Queen is attacking, bishop's attacking. I'm under threat of checkmate. Maybe the queen here would have been okay to stop that threat. Um, Regardless, what I ended up doing is castling, and that actually is recommended by engine as well in the analysis here on Lichess. So I guess that might be better move than trying to exchange the queen when you're a piece down already. After the castling, this threat here is negated because it's being guarded by king as well as the rook. So now bishop coming in won't be much of a benefit for white. So white decided what he should have done actually at this point anyway is to take my bishop. It's already ahead by a few points, having taken my knight for free. And of course here I took the uh, took the bishop with my king. Now white decided to bring out the knight, doing the development. And what I decided to do is threaten the white's bishop by bringing the pawn here and then eventually bringing the pawn all the way up, trapping the white's bishop if white is not careful. That's really the idea. So white continued with the development, castling first. I pushed my pawn for the bishop. Bishop went back. And here I continued pushing based on my plan. Of course, white didn't fall for that, so it moved the pawn up, really just challenging the pawn. But what I decided to do is it would be nice to push the pawn, threaten the bishop, and as the bishop retreats, instead of uh, opening the center up by taking the pawn, I would rather move the pawn up. So now I would have eventually a pawn. I can move this pawn up, and I would have a nice uh, pawn chain here. So with that idea, I pushed my pawn, bishop retreats. I pushed my b pawn, again setting up for that pawn chain that I was talking about a moment ago. White, of course, continued challenging my pawn, which is actually a bad idea because now it is blocked in when I moved my pawn up to a3. Now white is in a pinch because the bishop is stuck in the back rank. The knight cannot come here. Knight is blocked from coming out, so it has to take a longer route. Um, the rook will have a long way if it wants to become active. This rook has long way of coming out. So all the pieces, it would take some time for white to develop. And that's the benefit I had here. Um, the white continued development with bringing the knight out. And I just completely built my pawn chain all the way up here. Now, as the white continued, what I started looking at is what can I develop with? I can bring my knight out, eventually threatening the bishop. Uh, for knight, in this situation, this is the best square, being on the outpost at d4. So d4 happens to be the best piece for knight anyway. I also have this knight in my sights with the bishop if I really want to take it at some point. So that was the idea, and eventually I would figure out what I'm gonna do with my queen because this um, queen side is really blocked off with all these pawns completely locked in. So I will have to figure out how I'm gonna maneuver it. But sometimes the opportunity presents itself. So white decides to bring out the knight. I brought my rook out, trying to activate the rook by bringing out, and maybe eventually move the pawn one or two steps, depending on the situation. So that was the idea. Also, this is a filler move. Instead of jumping my knight up and offering an exchange, I wasn't in mood for exchanging the knights off right now. Given the close position, my knight was going to be my strength. So I decided to just start with the rook, have a filler move, gives me some space here to move and develop. White decided to bring out the knight. I think the idea with white here might have been that the white its own knights are kind of feeding off of each other. this knight out here is a good outpost. Of course, it's threatening these two pawns. It can bring the queen out here, and that would be a checkmate. So that is one threat. Um, it being here, if the queen comes here, and then if queen comes here and then attacks, that won't be a mating trait because of this rook and this rook. But again, knight being up here can do some damage. So that's really the idea that white is really moving with. What I did is, of course, brought out my knight as per the plan now that I didn't have this knight threatening my knight. So I had a way to really just come out and block some squares. Depending on what white does, I also have a very nice attack on um, e2 by bringing up my knight, giving a check. And as it stands right now, I also have a royal fork in play. So I would assume white didn't fall for that, but white actually did. What white ended up doing is it went on trying to protect the bishop. What would have been better is if white would have moved the bishop out, because what that would have done is once the bishop is on d1, it would have blocked off my knight's squares from knight attacking the king, or attacking the rook here by going to c2. Either way, when the bishop is on two squares over in a different color from knight, it blocks off the knight very nicely. If you look at these diagonals, knight cannot really go um, to b3, neither can it go to f3, um, it cannot go to c2, or it cannot go to e2 because it's all blocked off by the bishop. But instead of doing that, white made its biggest blunder here, and at that point I had my game completely turned around from being in a bad position overall from the engine's perspective to a completely winning position in just one move. And at this point, of course, I didn't miss. I went on to give the check, which then meant that white is completely lost with the uh, queen going in the next move. I can then completely start taking the pieces away. Um, and overall, it's in a locked position here with the pawn, so it would have a very difficult time coming out and developing the pieces. So at this point, my opponent resigned, and like I said, going from a relatively difficult or losing even game for me to in just two moves, my knight coming to d4, and then white making that mistake, allowing my knight to go to e2 and giving a royal fork. That really just won the game immediately. And here's the last game that I wanted to cover. In this one, I'm playing black. White starts with queen's pawn. Now, whenever my opponent plays the queen pawn, I usually respond in kind or with c5. In this game, I decided to respond with c5. If the opponent takes, I will always respond with a check. This is a no-brainer. That's how I like to play. So I gave a check, took the pawn. White threatened the queen, which doesn't really help much because it's just another move where white has played the knight twice, not helping it develop. My queen is safe in the back rank. And then white decided to start with the fiancetta. So here we go. I just brought out my knight, offering a trade. Um, White threatens, not much of a help. I'm actually developing here, right? Allows my my bishop to come out. And then white decides to take, of course, I take back, moves the pawn again. White, it seems at this point, wasn't decided whether it wants to fianchetto the bishop or it wants to bring the bishop out on a different diagonal. So it decided to move the pawn, which is kind of weird. I would have preferred developing my bishop since I already have the diagonal, the long diagonal actually open. Long diagonal is always preferred for the bishops. I developed, continued with the development as normal. At this point, um, White actually decided to challenge uh, with a check on my king, but that doesn't really help because it doesn't have anything to follow through with. I could respond with my knight, or I could respond with my uh, bishop. Well, I drew the arrows in reverse, but you get the point. So I responded with my knight and blocked the check. Um, White then pushed or decided to push my bishop away. And of course, it actually worked because I moved my bishop in a wrong place. I should have retreated back to either e6 or d7, but instead I decided to move up the board, which wasn't the best move because now white pushes the pawn. It is protected by both the queen and the knight. I don't have a choice but to retreat either back to the corner or actually that is the only best move. Going to d5 wouldn't work, but when I was playing the game, I didn't see that and I moved quickly to d5, which was a disaster. This is where the game turned uh, against me. If you look at the position now, queen takes. Queen is actually threatening the knight here along with the bishop. My queen can either guard or attack or do some other work, which isn't going to last long. It's going to have to give up one of the two duties. I can castle, but this rook on A is going to have to come out also if it wants to protect the knight at a minimum, and all of that is going to go against my position. So losing that knight here was not necessarily the best move, and it turned the game actually against me statistically. However, so at this point, I decided to castle immediately and white actually pounced. In fact, this castle wasn't necessarily the best move because the pawns can be pushed. Uh, these pawns would be under threat right ahead of the king. Instead of protecting, it would be fighting off the oncoming assault. White also has the white bishop that can retreat and threaten. The queen can come over and threaten. So there are multiple threats that are going to overwhelm me very quickly. So it's kind of, like I said, a lost game. Uh, and instead, of course, like I said earlier, in chess, winning is as much capitalizing on the mistakes of your opponent as much as your own strategy. So let's see what happened. Here I continued the push of the pawn to throw off the bishop, but it wasn't necessarily the best move because white is already up in development, is up in the pieces. I have lost my bishop. So by pushing, the bishop could easily just take and exchange off my good pieces here. And I would probably be left with little to work on. So this wasn't necessarily the best move, but at the time, that's what I did. White decided to move the bishop over to one of the best squares for it now that I'm castled, of course, threatening the h7 pawn. I moved the queen to b6 here. The idea is somehow find a way to take the e3 pawn, giving the check. But it's actually an empty threat without the follow-up. And right now, I don't have any other pieces backing up that move. So I would have a lot of work. The immediate threat, however, is taking this pawn. And if white is not careful, that could spell disaster. White, of course, decided to castle long on the queen side, protecting that pawn. Um, all of its attack now is on my king side. I moved my rook, just trying to find a way, threatening uh, the file where king is on. And white did what I was showing earlier, really just mounting its attack on the h7 pawn. Now this would be a checkmate immediately if I wasn't careful. Um, but I did see that, and I actually moved the pawn, threatening the queen. Now, this is where one of the things that I noticed was black's queen was in a precarious position at this point if it wasn't careful. And the first thing is white has to get out of trouble by moving the queen either to h6 or move, uh, because if you look at the position, queen actually can't go to any of the g5, f5, e5, you name it, right? This is the only safe square right now for queen d5 if it wants to move out, right? Going to c5, b5, a5 is all protected. So the only escape route for queen, if he wanted to, was going back to d5 square. But instead, white decided to come in and occupy h6. Now, this is where I saw an opportunity because white's queen is really blocked here. If white's not careful, right? Again, going back to this square, that these are the two escape squares for queen. The other escape square is f4, but that's occupied by white's own bishop. So there is at least two steps. First, that bishop must move out, and then the queen can escape. So I saw that, and what I decided to do is make room so that I can threaten the queen with my bishop. So the plan was in motion. I moved the rook out of the way, and this is where white really did its queen in. It didn't see the threat coming in, and it decided to push the pawn, really just trying to threaten my king side. But at this point, this wouldn't have worked as much. Now, white's idea might have been that when I take with the pawn, it takes with the pawn. Now, queen and rook are connected, attacking my h7 pawn, really making a room for a checkmate. But that's not really what I was planning anyway, so it actually worked out very well for me. White did its queen in, and I immediately pounced with my bishop, attacking the queen. Now queen has absolutely nowhere to go. It's stuck. Um, it has no compensation whatsoever at this point. And again, just like that, the game turned really quickly from being against me to in my favor, and my opponent resigned. So there you have it. Not necessarily the grandmaster um, level of analysis, but that's not who I am, right? I'm amateur, and at my level, of course, this is the best that I could do, and I think I did well in the given situation. So hopefully you enjoyed it, learned something from it. I will see you next time.